when the night sky over Britain burned with the light of German incendiaries. The war felt close enough to touch. Between 1940 and 1941, the Luftwaffe's night raids had turned the blackout into a battlefield. Cities glowed with firestorms, sirens howled, and ordinary streets became lines on a bomber's map. Yet as German crews grew confident in their pathfinders and precision, British defense planners were working on an idea that would turn that confidence against them. A network of secret sites designed to deceive. These would become known as Starfish Sites, from the initials SF meaning special fire. They were the brainchild of Colonel John Turner, an engineer who had seen how German bombers followed visual cues. Turner realized that if you could imitate the signature of a city on fire, the light, the smoke, the heat, you might be able to lure the bombers away entirely. The plan sounded absurd at first. Build fake cities, light them up under attack, and hope the enemy took the bait. But the urgency of 1940 left no room for hesitation. By late that year, Turner's experimental decoy fires had been tested near Bristol and Southampton. Wooden frameworks, oil drums, and water tanks were arranged to mimic burning factories, railway yards, and docks. When real raids began, the decoys were triggered from bunkers by small crews who waited in silence until the distant hum of engines filled the night. Then, with a series of carefully timed flares and controlled fires, they gave the Luftwaffe the illusion it wanted, a target ablaze. It worked. German crews, believing they were striking at major industrial centers, dropped their bombs on open fields. Observers reported entire waves of bombers veering toward the false glow miles from their intended objectives. As the decoy flames consumed their fuel, the men inside the control bunkers could sometimes feel the ground tremble from explosions meant for a city that slept safely in darkness. What began as an improvised trick soon evolved into one of the most effective deception systems of the war, a secret defense effort that stretched from Scotland to the south coast. Hidden in plain sight as the Blitz intensified, so did Britain's mastery of illusion. What began as a handful of experimental fire sites soon expanded into a vast network of deception stretching across the country. The Air Ministry approved the scheme in full, and under Colonel Turner's direction, more than 200 Starfish installations were built. They covered key industrial and port cities, London, Birmingham, Sheffield, Bristol, Glasgow, and many others, each carefully placed in isolated terrain just far enough to draw enemy bombers away from real targets, but close enough to appear convincing on their radar and visual approach. Every site was a miniature world of controlled destruction. Pyrotechnic engineers and civil defense teams designed patterns of burning to mimic the chaotic spread of bomb damage. Long trenches were dug to channel burning oil, forming the flickering shapes of streets and railway lines seen from 10,000 feet. Piles of wood and tar barrels stood ready to create explosions and glowing embers. Electric arcs simulated tram lines or power stations. From the air, through haze and smoke, it all looked heartbreakingly real. The timing of these displays was crucial. If the fires began too early, Luftwaffe navigators would see through the ruse. Too late, and the real cities would already be hit. Operators listened by telephone to air raid observers, radar stations, and Royal Observer Corps posts. Once it was confirmed that the enemy had passed over the true target, they threw switches that turned the countryside into a sea of artificial flames. The technique demanded both courage and precision. Many crews waited in bunkers barely protected from falling debris, lighting their decoys as bombs whistled down around them. The psychological effect on the Luftwaffe was profound. Crews reported confusion and uncertainty as familiar landmarks appeared to burn in the wrong places. Some units logged direct hits on factories that never existed. German reconnaissance photographs later revealed vast bomb craters in open farmland, proof that the deception had worked on a massive scale. British intelligence soon estimated that in certain raids, as much as half of the bomb load intended for cities had fallen harmlessly on these decoy fields. In an era before electronic countermeasures and advanced radar jamming, this was deception reduced to its purest form: light, fire, and human nerve. The Starfish network stood as a silent burning guardian, turning the enemy's weapons into wasted fury. To BY 1941, the Starfish network had proven its worth beyond dispute. The Home Office, seeing its success, broadened the concept. Deception now became an organized arm of Britain's air defense strategy. Alongside the fiery illusions, new categories of decoy emerged, each tailored to fool a different kind of Luftwaffe attack. The Q sites were designed for night operations. They simulated towns and industrial zones using dimmed electric lighting to suggest workers, housing, or factory skylights. From the air, the subtle patterns of light seemed to mark living, breathing cities in blackout defiance. K sites, in contrast, operated by day, often representing dummy airfields meant to lure German fighters and bombers away from RAF bases. Canvas hangars, fake aircraft made of wood and wire, and even imitation runways were constructed across the countryside. From certain altitudes, the deception was flawless. All of these sites were coordinated under what became known as the decoy control system. At its peak, more than 600 decoy sites protected Britain's industrial and strategic heartlands. The secrecy surrounding them was absolute. Few civilians ever knew they existed, and even among the Home Guard, only select personnel were informed. The men who maintained the decoys, technicians, electricians, and volunteers, worked mostly at night, living in small concrete bunkers or huts camouflaged into hedgerows. Their duty was not glamorous, but their contribution proved vital. German intelligence struggled to understand why their carefully plotted raids were suddenly less effective. Bombing reports grew increasingly inaccurate. Reconnaissance photos confused analysts, showing damage in open fields miles from mapped targets. In Berlin, questions were raised about whether British cities had been relocated or shielded by some new form of camouflage. Few realized that the British were not hiding their cities. They were building new ones, made entirely of illusion. In London, Winston Churchill personally commended the ingenuity of the Starfish effort. He understood the strategic advantage of turning deception into defense. Each bomb dropped on a decoy site was one less falling on homes, hospitals, or munitions plants. In purely human terms, the difference was measured in lives saved. Some estimates suggested that over the course of the war, the decoy program prevented tens of thousands of civilian casualties and preserved critical infrastructure that might otherwise have been destroyed. But the work came at a cost. Operators faced real danger each night, stationed close enough to lure bombs, but far enough to be denied the comfort of public recognition. Their heroism remained largely unsung, hidden behind the glow of the fires they created. Few cities demonstrated the success of Britain's decoy strategy more vividly than Bristol. In November 1940, the port city had endured devastating bombing that left its docks and industrial districts in ruins. Learning from that destruction, the authorities constructed several Starfish sites in the surrounding hills. When the Luftwaffe returned months later, they found the countryside ablaze with what looked like burning shipyards and factories. Bomber crews released their payloads over the false fires, leaving the real Bristol largely untouched. Contemporary civil defense reports describe how, as bombs fell harmlessly into fields, the city below remained eerily quiet, its blackout unbroken, its people unaware that salvation was burning just a few miles away. Exeter's experience told a similar story. In the spring of 1942, as the Luftwaffe launched its Baedeker raids, retaliatory attacks on Britain's historic cities, the decoy network played a crucial role. When German Pathfinder aircraft approached Exeter, the Starfish fires to the east were ignited at precisely the right moment. The glow drew the following bomber formations away from the cathedral city, and much of their ordnance was wasted on empty farmland. Though Exeter still suffered damage, contemporary analysts concluded that without the decoy intervention, the destruction would have been catastrophic. Farther north, Glasgow's decoy sites protected one of the most vital industrial centers in the empire. Shipyards on the Clyde were prime targets, producing the lifeblood of the Atlantic convoys. To guard them, engineers created an intricate system of both fire and light decoys that stretched across moorland and bog. On multiple occasions in 1941, Luftwaffe raids that should have crippled the docks were instead diverted onto these remote areas. Eyewitnesses recalled watching distant fires on the horizon while the city itself remained cloaked in darkness. For those operating the sites, the nights were long, cold, and perilous. Crews of just a handful of men managed the elaborate fire systems, often guided only by radio and the dull drone of engines above. When bombs fell too close, they waited motionless in their bunkers, trusting the earth and concrete to hold. Their bravery rarely reached newspapers. Secrecy forbade it, but their work left a quiet legacy, measured not in medals, but in the absence of death. As 1943 approached, Britain's skies began to shift. The Luftwaffe's focus turned east toward the Soviet front, and the great raids on British cities diminished. Yet the decoy sites remained on alert, their operators ready each night to light fires they hoped would never again be needed. By 1943, Britain's defenses had transformed from desperate improvisation to refined coordination. Radar improved anti-aircraft fire, and the hard lessons of 2 years of night raids had reshaped the nation's approach to air warfare. Yet the Starfish and their kindred sites remained indispensable. The Luftwaffe was still capable of striking deep into the British Isles, and even a single raid could inflict heavy civilian casualties. The decoy network was therefore maintained, upgraded, and increasingly integrated into the wider tapestry of Allied deception. As radar became central to both sides' strategies, the British adapted their illusions to meet the challenge. New decoys began to incorporate dummy radar reflections. Metallic strips, known as window, were sometimes deployed near sites to create false echoes on German screens. Engineers modified lighting arrays to mimic the glow of industrial power grids visible to night optics. In some cases, Starfish crews coordinated with Royal Air Force night fighter control to lure enemy bombers into trap zones where radar-directed interceptors waited. The line between passive defense and active deception began to blur. These methods formed the foundation for Britain's later large-scale deception operations. The same technical minds who perfected the Starfish would go on to design the elaborate feints of Operation Fortitude, the great phantom army used to mislead the Germans before D-Day. Many of the same principles applied: careful control of light, sound, and radar signatures to create the illusion of strength where none existed. In that sense, the glowing hills of wartime Britain were the training ground for one of the most decisive strategic tricks of the 20th century. As the tide of war turned and Allied bombers struck back at German cities, the once relentless Luftwaffe lost its reach. Raids became sporadic, then rare. By 1944, many Starfish sites were mothballed or dismantled, their operators reassigned. Fields that had once blazed with artificial infernos returned to quiet farmland. The craters left behind slowly filled with grass and rainwater, hiding the traces of the nights they had burned to save others. Though the Starfish no longer lit the sky, their legacy endured in the minds of the planners who had witnessed their success. Britain's mastery of deception, born of necessity, would become a defining element of Allied warfare in the final years of the conflict. When the war ended in 1945, the fields that had once served as decoys fell silent. Their bunkers were sealed, their wiring stripped, and their fires extinguished forever. To the casual passerby, there was little to suggest that these patches of countryside had once been among the most closely guarded secrets in Britain. Farmers resumed plowing the land, unaware that the soil beneath their boots had once glowed like a false sunrise. For decades, the Starfish sites remained absent from official histories, buried under the blanket of wartime secrecy that still covered many defense operations. It was not until the 1960s that fragments of the story began to surface. Declassified documents revealed the scale of the deception network and the extraordinary ingenuity behind it. Historians and aviation researchers traced the remnants of the sites: circular scars in aerial photographs, concrete control bunkers overgrown with moss, rusted fuel drums half buried in hedgerows. Each discovery told a small part of a vast, forgotten effort. Surviving operators, by then old men, spoke quietly of the nights they spent lighting decoys while bombs rained nearby. Their recollections carried no dramatization, only the steady, matter-of-fact tone of those who had done their duty without expecting fame. They recalled how they had timed the ignition of flares by counting seconds between distant explosions, and how, after the all-clear, they would emerge to find bomb craters yards away from their shelters. Few outside military circles ever knew their names, yet their courage had saved entire districts from ruin. In the decades that followed, historians came to view the Starfish as more than just a technical curiosity. They represented a distinct form of warfare, one that relied not on superior weapons, but on superior imagination. The program blended engineering, psychology, and artistry, proof that survival sometimes depended as much on illusion as on force. Today, remnants of these sites still lie hidden across Britain. A few are preserved by heritage trusts. Others exist only in faint outlines visible from the air on clear days. To those who study them, they stand as monuments to quiet brilliance, a reminder that in Britain's darkest hours, salvation sometimes came not from guns or walls, but from light and deception. When German pilots reported their successful bombings of burning targets, they never knew they had been tricked by empty hills and fields, and that ignorance, engineered by a handful of determined engineers and volunteers, saved thousands of lives.